Okay, good morning, students. Welcome back to our classes on film studies. We have discussed one of the most important films in the history of filmmaking and discussed the features of an important film movement, that is, Soviet montage, and we have studied a representative film, Battleship Potemkin, which is considered as a landmark in the history of films, often considered as one of the best films ever made for its sheer craft and for the way it influenced filmmaking later. We need to be familiar with the theory of montage as expressed by Eisenstein, and we saw how he justified the use of montage, proving that montage, or the kind of juxtaposition that montage entails or brings with it, is part and parcel of life itself and of all the cultural and artistic and creative activities that we engage in, whether it is literature, whether it is painting, whether it is sculpture, any form of literature. You have this kind of beauty emerging when you have the juxtaposition of images, impressions, ideas, and so on. So that is how that movement, the movement known as Soviet montage, gave a lot of mileage to the growth of the film industry by developing and by contributing and developing a new kind of language for films. So, leaving you to explore Soviet montage further, let me now take you to another movement, another film movement, a major film movement, and this one is Italian Neorealism, to do which allow me to get the presentation ready. I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So the introductory slide here shows a screen grab or a shot from the film that we have to discuss in the context of Italian Neorealism. That is one of the film movements that you have to study in your syllabus, and there would be no doubt that the film that is depicted here, The Bicycle Thief or Bicycle Thieves, the translation sometimes varies, that is considered as probably the most representative of this movement known as Italian Neorealism. So let us enter the discussion of Italian realism with a remark made by one of the major filmmakers, alive and significant today, Martin Scorsese, who owes much to this movement of Italian Neorealism. He was inspired so much by it, and he bases his craft very much on the school of the movement called Italian Neorealism. And what Martin Scorsese said about Italian Neorealism can in one way be considered as epitomizing the movement. This movement was a rehabilitation, a kind of rehabilitation of an entire culture and people through cinema. So the way that it revived a whole culture, the culture that is being discussed is that of Italy. After the Second World War, the way that Italy rebuilt itself, a large credit for that goes to the filmmakers who recreated Italy from its ruins. It was totally shattered during the Second World War, and the way that the country emerged from that to that, that whole history is what is conveyed through the films of Italian Neorealism, and the movement went on to play a major role in reviving Italy and Italy's culture. Okay, so that is the first remark that can be made about Italian Neorealism. We have, I think, highlighted the significance of that movement. Now, just to appreciate where Italian neorealism stands and how it is in relation to other major movements, let's just take a look at the major film movements. If you study the history of films, of course, we begin with the late 19th century. That is when you have the early ventures, people experimenting with the new invention, the film, and then the light, the play of light and all that. And you have the early experiments in cinema. We remember the experiments of the Lumiere brothers and so on. From the 1890s to the 1910s, you can consider as the period of early cinema. It was a new medium, and this was something that naturally made waves. People were equally fascinated and shocked by these new things that they saw out there. It was a marvel for them to look at seeing this on screen. I told you how that image of the train arriving on the station was so terrifying to the people that many are believed to have run out of the theater where it was shown, believing that the train would come right into their midst. Anyway, with that kind of very happening beginning, something which stirred everybody's curiosity and interest, and you have a great deal of interest in this new medium. You have the art and the craft of cinema spreading to various regions, various parts of the world. And one of the earliest film movements that we can talk about would be that of Soviet montage. We discussed that in the light of the film Battleship Potemkin, and we saw how in Russia, they developed a state-sponsored kind of cinema. But it was a country that, again, was trying to stand on its own 2 feet and trying to manage with whatever was available. And it is in that context that you have the filmmakers experimenting with whatever available little shots and films they had, and thereby developing this whole new technique of montage, and thereby creating a new language for cinema. So from the 1920s to the 1930s, that is the peak of Soviet montage, where you, of course, have the works of Kuleshov, of course, the filmmaker who taught in the Soviet film school. And then you have Pudovkin, Eisenstein, Vertov, and other filmmakers. In another part of the world at that point of time, a new kind of film movement was emerging, and that is what is known as German Expressionism. I know we are familiar with Expressionist theater, and in film as well, you have a parallel development after the First World War. The Second World War, we know, was imminent. Everybody knew that it was just a matter of time before the Second World War erupted. There was, that feeling of an imminent battle, especially perceptible in Germany, a country that had taken a severe beating during the First World War. And with the rise of Hitler, everyone knew that it was only a matter of some time before the Second World War erupted. So in that era of great fear and the war looming large over the horizon, and a general feeling of nihilism and so on, you have German filmmakers also creating a new movement called German Expressionism, where you have the filmmakers, as in the theater, using the exaggerated shadows, sets and colors and so on to convey that surreal feeling, that something looming, something in the horizon, some fear lurking somewhere. That was highlighted as it was in Expressionist theater too. So that again, was to influence filmmakers in other parts of the world. It definitely did make a statement. In a few years' time, you have the development of another movement in Europe again, but in another country in Europe, and that is Italian Neorealism. It was after the Second World War that this movement came into the forefront. From during the 1940s, and the 50s, with Italy trying to rebuild itself after the Second World War, you have a new movement emerging. That is what we will be discussing. So more about that later. The realistic films that came up with non-actors, real settings, and stark tones that depicted the poverty and the crime and the social reality of those times. And even, I mean, one can, we will, of course, talk about the great influence wielded by this film movement and the way it influenced filmmakers in various parts of the world, including India. Then you have the French New Wave in the 1950s, a new wave emerging with the publication of a journal like Cahiers du Cinema. You have this, filmmakers looking for innovative ways, innovative shots, innovative camera angles, and conveying or telling the stories on screen in whole new ways. I'm sure you will be discussing French New Wave in great detail in the light of the movie. I think there is a movie, it is a prescribed movement in your syllabus, and you do have one of the major filmmakers, I think Godard's film, that you will be discussing to learn more about this French New Wave. Parallelly, you have Hollywood, Hollywood, which is always characterized as the mecca of filmmaking. Even though today Hollywood is no longer the industry that makes the maximum number of movies. At one point of time, I think it was Bollywood, the Indian film industry, or the Indian Hindi film industry, which made more movies than Hollywood. These days, I think the Nigerian film industry, the Korean film industry, and so on, they probably have overtaken Hollywood. But in any case, the influence of Hollywood is something that just cannot be over exaggerated because it is prominent, and that the kind of global reach that Hollywood cinema has, I don't think any other film industry can claim that kind of reach. So the era of classic Hollywood, that would be sometime during the 1950s and 60s, where you have these huge movies being made, lavish productions, big budget films with huge film stars, and these are films made by initially you have these production houses, the major production houses like Paramount Pictures, Warner Brothers, Columbia Pictures, and Universal Studios, the huge production houses, who would actually buy the actors and the directors. They had that kind of wealth, and they would dictate terms as to how the films ought to be made. And there are certain predominant features of these classic Hollywood movies. I'm sure you are discussing one such movie to learn more about the classic Hollywood movement. So you can discuss that later. Against all this, against the predominance of the Hollywood industry, you have the emergence of third cinema, what is known as third cinema. Third cinema is what emerges in contrast to the first world cinema, characterized by the commercial entertainment films made in Hollywood, also against the second cinema, or the second world cinema, the artistic films made in Europe, the films that belong to the French New Wave, Italian and German Expressionism and all that. They consider those as art films. Hollywood is the hub of commercial cinema, Europe that of art films. That can be considered as second cinema. But both of these are kind of elitist in their own way. They are meant for the specialists. The directors there are specialists, the producers are specialists, and it is meant for a certain kind of crowd that can appreciate that kind of film. It's not the film that reaches down to the masses, according to the proponents of third cinema. We will be discussing third cinema in great detail and appreciating it for the anti-colonial stand that third cinema took and the way it encouraged filmmaking in countries like Argentina, where it began, Iran, Brazil, India, a new kind of filmmaking technique, and using films to convey their realities. They considered the camera as a weapon. It does exactly the role that a gun does in other cultures. In other words, we say that the pen is mightier than the sword. The camera here acts the role of that kind of a mighty weapon, which can bring about change in the world outside. We'll discuss third cinema in great detail. These are some of the major film movements. Of course, apart from this, you have each country's film industry claiming its own uniqueness. The British film industry, the Indian film industry, the Japanese, the Korean, the Iranian, the Brazilian, the Nigerian, and so on. Some of these, I guess, you will be discussing. I think probably you have Japanese and Indian, and maybe a Korean movie too. We definitely have an Iranian movie to discuss. So, with this brief idea about the major film movements, let us now focus our attention on the movement that we have to study in detail, that is Italian Neorealism. In Italian, it is called Neorealismo. It was a kind of development of what was known as the Realismo movement. It was a brief movement in Italian art, the Realismo, a very realistic kind of art expression in art. But due to other trends, you have a newer wave of that emerging in the post-Second World War Italy, and that is what they called Neorealismo. And we cannot discuss the history of films without talking about the influence wielded by a few filmmakers who today we recognize as Italian Neorealist filmmakers. So Neorealismo, as the term, I'm sure that it's quite clear to you that the term means a new reality or new realism, and it sprouted in the wake of the Second World War in Italy. It is a term that we use to characterize literature, art in general, and specifically the film industry, film experiments that aimed to provide insight into the contemporary Italian society of the 1940s. What life was in post-Second World War Italy, especially for the common man, and how Italy could rebuild itself. These were some of the concerns. And it sought to deal realistically with the events that led up to the war. It conveyed in various films the kind of situation that led to the war, and then it also dealt in a very realistic way with the social problems that came up precisely because of the war and the destruction that the war brought with it. It is significant because it marked a significant turning away from the kind of escapism, which you can really detect in some of the art forms made during the interwar years. Interwar years, you could refer to the 1920s and the early 30s, that is between the First World War, which ended in 1919, and the outbreak of the Second World War in the late 1930s. So during that interwar years, you have, people, of course, we know that it was the time when people like Mussolini came into power, with that kind of fascist rule there were a lot of things that could not be said. So one can sense a kind of escapism, that is depicted in the various art forms of those times. People not specifying the truth or not really referring to the truth, and a kind of escapism, and straying or turning away from that kind of escapism. You have a new crop of writers, artists, and filmmakers taking a very close, realistic, candid, and frank look at the prevailing conditions in post-war Italy. It was, as I told you, very much similar to the earlier Italian movement of Verismo, from which it originated. But it differs from Verismo because, you have a greater intensity in the films of Neorealism. Intense feelings, experiences, and convictions that the repression of the fascist regime had gifted and instilled in many of its writers. So Realismo was a term used to describe the art expressions that had not yet experienced the fascist regime. Neorealismo was something that was influenced by Realismo or Verismo or Realism, but it had the acid test of the fascist regime also behind it. So that experience gave them a whole new edge. And you have this added impetus that was given to the movement by the translation of many socially conscious American and English writers during the 1930s and the 1940s. You can think of the works of To just to name of mention a name that we would be familiar with, the kind of poetry written by Auden and his group during the 1930s and 40s and so on. In America also, you have many writers writing, in a very socially conscious way. This was also something that emboldened the Neorealismo artists in Italy. And if you look at literature, this is the era of some of the great Italian writers like Salvatore Quasimodo, Alberto Moravia, then you have Carlo Levi, and among the other names there, I'm sure the name of Italo Calvino is definitely very familiar to you. So this is in the field of literature, but we need to talk about the filmmakers, okay? And the Neorealist movement in film paralleled the Italian literary movement. And they too focused, as the writers did, these filmmakers also focused on showing Italy that was now finally free of fascist influence. Mussolini's era had ended, and these people now could project the menace of fascism in their works. It was a kind of very realistic documentary-like objectivity that they chose, because such were the stories that they wanted to convey. Moreover, they too, had to make do with what was available. There was a huge film studio, that had been instituted by Mussolini's regime. It was called Cinecittà in Italy. It means a film studio. It was, I think, one of the largest film studios ever made in any part of the world. So even some of the Hollywood movies were made there, actually. That was, of course, after the Second World War. But, this was a film studio that had been sponsored by Mussolini's regime in exactly the way that the Russian film school was sponsored by the new regime there, in order to provide or to promote propaganda films. In Mussolini's case, they wanted films that conveyed the glory of Mussolini and his regime. And this studio became a very, sought after target during the Allied bomb attacks. During the Second World War, the Allied forces, they were targeting many hotspots in countries like Germany and Italy and Japan and so on. And this film studio, Cinecittà, was a particular target, because they knew that this was a hub that produced propaganda films that supported Mussolini's kind of fascism. So they wanted to destroy that film studio, and that is what they did. And to make films after the destruction of that studio was a tall order for the filmmakers. But the way that they made do with whatever was available and came up with a new kind of filmmaking, that is what is significant. So Neorealist productions were often crudely and hastily made, because they were making do with whatever was available, and their radical departure from the escapist idealization of the traditional movie making, and their boldness in handling contemporary themes have, as I told you, an international impact. We'll discuss the we'll discuss the influence they wielded on film industries in other parts of the world. And we enter Italian Neorealism with the words of one of its major filmmakers, Roberto Rossellini. Rossellini's daughter, I think, was later to become Martin Scorsese's wife. That is also a personal connection. That's beside the point, however. And Roberto Rossellini's words, I think, can again be used to symbolize the whole of this movement. He said, "I tried to capture reality and nothing else." The aim of cinema, according to him, was to capture reality, not for entertainment, but to project reality out there. And the major filmmakers, some of the names again would be familiar to you: Federico Fellini, Roberto Rossellini, Vittorio De Sica, and Luchino Visconti. It is the third director there, De Sica, whom we will be discussing, because he is the one who made one of the most significant of Italian Neorealist films, and that is The Bicycle Thieves. And the notable films, Rossellini's Rome Open City, that is considered as one of the first of these Italian neorealist films. Then we have The Bicycle Thieves, Fellini's Vitelloni, Umberto D by again De Sica, and Visconti's La Terra Trema. So 1940s and 50s, this is the time that Italian neorealism was in its peak in Italy. So these are the names that you have to be familiar with. Yeah, this is about Cinecittà. As I told you, this is the entrance to that. It was in 1937 that Mussolini, the Italian dictator, founded Cinecittà, a huge studio. And the slogan of the studio was, "Cinema is the strongest weapon." Every industry, uses film as a weapon for propaganda. Any ideology. So we saw that in force in Russia. And now you can see that in force in Mussolini. So Mussolini's whole intention was to create this film studio in order to encourage filmmakers to make films that glorified him, his party, his ideology, and all that he stood for. Okay, and that was exactly what was made. And as I told you, yeah, it was a major part of the fascist government's attempt to develop a domestic film industry to parallel Hollywood. This is the way in which they thought that one sure shot way in which they could counter American supremacy in the field of culture. So to produce propaganda films for the Italian state. But during the Second World War, the Allied forces particularly targeted Cinecittà, and the studio was almost entirely destroyed. If you enter Cinecittà, this is the kind of scene that you would see anything and everything that you want. Huge palaces, huge forts, mansions, anything and everything. This, of course, would be probably a set for a Greek film, something like Troy, Helen of Troy would have been, it definitely was shot in Cinecittà. I don't know if you have seen Helen of Troy, one of the massive Hollywood productions like Cleopatra, Ben-Hur, and so on. All these movies were made in Cinecittà. These are some of the iconic names in Hollywood history. And of course, these were made after the studio was remade after the Second World War. So some of you would probably have been to the Ramoji Film City, where you would find all these kind of settings, anything and everything that you want, whether you want a foreign-looking locale or a village scene or a cafe or a palace or a bar, whatever, anything and everything is erected there. And some of these are permanent sets that you have in Cinecittà. So it's a glorious, it's often called, because the films like Ben-Hur and Helen of Troy and so on were made here, Cleopatra, they were all made in Cinecittà. This studio is very often referred to as Hollywood by the Tiber. Tiber is, of course, the river, by Tiber or Tyne, I think one of those two rivers, the river, beside which Rome stands. So this is exactly the facilities that Hollywood provided. So that is Cinecittà. Here was Mussolini inaugurating. You can find Mussolini here, and the large crowds that gathered at the inauguration of the theater in 1937. It was, and there again, as I showed you with Eisenstein's case, a Google Doodle. This was Google Doodle's tribute to Cinecittà on one occasion, the kind of settings, all the major landmarks, whether it is the Big Ben of London or the capital of the United States or a Mexican city or a Greek structure, anything, you have it all in Cinecittà. So that is a Google Doodle. So this prestigious film city studio was severely damaged, and then the new directors, the filmmakers who wanted to make films, they had to seek different alternative filmmaking practices with the limited options that they had to find new ways. And that is how, instead of going into the studio, they decided to go into the street and to film make films shot on ordinary locations, not in studios. They did not have, of course, the money to rent huge studios. The studio was also disrupted. They could not build new sets. So what did they do? They decided to shoot it on the streets, in the marketplace, on the beach, in the railway station, in an office, and so on, in real locations. This again was a major new development. Till then, films could only be made in studios, in specific places where you would have a set created to give you the desired background. You have seen that in old films, right? The studio kind of set, whether it is a garden or the inside of a home or a kitchen, it's all studio set. It's all shot in a studio set. But now you have the arrival of a daring new film form where they proved that films could be shot in just any place, ordinary locations like the street. So they took it out of the studios. They could not make huge payments to the actors. You can imagine, to make payments to film actors like Shah Rukh Khan or Mammootty or Mohanlal. I mean, that kind of thing would have been impossible for them, as stripped as they were of their resources. And the economy was in a very bad shape. And what did they do, therefore, to make up for that, to meet that problem? They decided to use non-actors, ordinary people, taking people from the common people and asking them to enact the kind of roles. But the films did not suffer in any way because of the absence of huge film stars, because the stories that they told were very much resonant with the people. The people could relate to that quite well, in exactly the same way that a movie like The Great Indian Story, even with the absence of superstars, it is, I think, making waves and being watched by people all over the world in a way that even a superstars film would not be watched, because it conveys the reality that resonates with everyone. So, these group of filmmakers, they were trying, we must talk about the significance of a journal, a magazine called Cinema. Now, Cinema was, of course, a journal that was strictly under the control of the government, Mussolini's government. Even after his fall, I think it was his son-in-law also who was the editor of that magazine. It was a kind of family affair. The fascist regime had made it that way. And you find that they were unable to get their works published. People who began to think differently, people who wanted to criticize the kind of films that were being made in Cinecittà with the patronage of Mussolini and the fascist regime and so on. So you have the development of a new kind of culture. Since they could not get themselves published in cinema, they decided to make new films and get others to write about those films. They wanted to turn away from the kind of films that were being made then. They were largely called telefoni bianchi. It's an Italian phrase which means white telephone films, telefoni bianchi. That is, films which deliberately tried to copy Hollywood films. And Hollywood films have this fancy setting and, posh life being projected out there. The kind of wealth and the kind of what shall you say, elitism, that was projected up there, or the kind of lifestyle that was projected in Hollywood cinema. These Italian filmmakers tried to copy that. And the white telephone would have been a symbol of that, because the black telephone is what you normally have. That represents common life. But in Hollywood, you have the development by that time, and, the rich, wealthy households having white telephones. That would have been a symbol of great prestige at that point of time. And these Italian films, which tried to copy Hollywood cinema, because it was Mussolini's intention to match up to Hollywood's influence. Naturally, the commercial films that were made were cheap imitations of American comedies. Comedies in the sense of, films that did not have much weight, which did not deal with any heavy or weighty topics, but films made largely for entertainment. They were just not interested in conveying the struggles of the ordinary people. And this kind of frustration, not being able to write for this art magazine, not being able to make the kind of films, etc. This kind of frustration towards conservative escapist cinema was somewhat suppressed in print, as I told you, because of the editor-in-chief was the son of Mussolini himself. And added to that, the situation created by the destruction of Cinecittà film studios led to a sudden shift in Italian cinema, both in terms of filmmaking and the topics that they chose to convey. And these two defining factors ultimately led to the rise of Neorealism, Italian Neorealism, faced with a severe lack of resources, but with a whole lot of issues discussed. These filmmakers shot traditional productions. Now they made the end of the Second World War and the consequent end of the German occupation allowed the Neorealist movement to thrive artistically, using minimal equipment, shooting on real locations on the streets and so on, using non-professional actors, and great faith in their purpose. They were convinced about what they were doing. So it signified the poverty, the strife, and the new reality of Italy after the Second World War. And these are the major features of Italian Neorealist movement. It brought in a new kind of democratic spirit because you have the value of the ordinary people. It's not the superhero who matters here. It is not the superstar who matters here. The crowd is the hero, and ordinary people can play the roles of, the story of ordinary people can be told. And since it was shot in the street, you have a lot of common people there. So that kind of, against the fascist regime, democracy, the wave of democracy coming in, that is something that symbolizes or characterizes Italian Neorealism. And you have a very compassionate point of view that does not make moral judgments. The kind of moral judgments that were popularized by the propaganda films made in Cinecittà. Against that, a more empathetic kind of cinema which concerned itself with the problems of the common man. That is what emerges with Italian Neorealism. So it does everything possible to convey the horrors of Italian fascism, or the Italy's fascist past, and its aftermath after the devastation during the Second World War. And it's a new kind of film which has a kind of coming together of Christian values, Christianity, and also Marxism. So that kind of blending again was something that made these films stand out. You do not have Marxism as set off against religion. It's a coming together of these two that you have here, and an emphasis on emotions rather than abstract ideas, as it was in certain other film industries. Abstract ideas being conveyed. Here you have emotions, an emotional story being told. So that is the ideological feature of Italian Neorealism. Now, stylistically, in what manner was that matter conveyed? Number one, they avoided any neatly plotted story like the Hollywood film, which has a proper beginning, a climax, and then a resolution and so on, where you have a tight action-packed drama. Here you do not have that kind of plot. The plot is not all in these films. You have loose episodic structures because the life of the common man is not always in the form of a Greek tragedy. It is not one that can be conveyed like that. It is ordinary, it is loose, it is episodic. It's not every day that you have a climax happening there. It's not every day that you have the kind of things that you have in commercial cinema. So these are loose plots. You have a kind of documentary visual style, not anything for the sake of effect. You do not have anything that is larger than life. You do not have blaring music. Very often the music that is heard here is soft, slow, and sometimes even sad. Generally it is the visual style of a documentary that is adopted here. People who are caught doing their real jobs, people selling things in a shop, pushing things on a cart, working in a factory, and so on. As they are seen working in real situations. People are not acting here. Even the central characters are seen doing ordinary things. So they do use actual locations and mostly always the exteriors rather than studio sites. The use of non-professional actors, especially because they could not afford proper actors. And to tell the story of ordinary people, they thought that non-professional actors were best. And you do not have an elaborate dialogue style, that you have ordinary conversational speech in this kind of film. You do not have any clever kind of editing, camera work, lighting, and so on. That kind of elaborate studio arrangement where you have the key light, the fill light, and the backlight, and so on, to create the desired impact. No, ordinary camera work with normal shots, not low angle or high angle always, but normal eye level shots. Normal editing, no clever, intelligent kind of editing, and ordinary lighting to create that simplicity. And alongside, you can also see a lot of children being brought in. Again, the kind of reality that could be conveyed through a child's eye, the innocent, non-agenda stand that a child can have, in the absence of an ideological vision, and also probably because they wouldn't have to pay an enormous pay package to a child artist. You can see, a large number of child actors in these films. Again, in the film that we have to discuss, that is a predominant feature. So these are the features, these are the stylistic features of Italian neorealism. And the filmmakers went on to influence filmmakers all over the world. It is said that Satyajit Ray happened to visit, Europe at this point of time, and watching Bicycle Thieves, the movie that we have to study and discuss, he was so impressed, and he went back home and made which one? Pather Panchali. He said, oh, this is how films ought to be made, and he went back to make Pather Panchali and the rest of the Oppo trilogy. But it does not end with India. It had a great deal of influence in so many other film schools in different parts of Europe and different parts of the world also. Even African films have been greatly influenced by Italian neorealism. Hollywood style and Hollywood's technique and Hollywood's influence is something that cannot be easily replicated, because America is, of course, a hugely large, rich country, and it's not every country that can replicate that. So that's something that you can be fascinated by. But to make your own films, Italian neorealism was a more predominant influence. And also that it came with this, it fascinated people because it was something that signaled Italy's national rebirth as a full-fledged democracy. And that is why Italian neorealism is often considered as the golden age of Italian cinema. So you can think of Martin Scorsese as one filmmaker to think of the eminent position that he has today as a filmmaker, and he owes it all, he says, to the Italian neorealist filmmakers. So there are very few filmmakers who are not influenced by Italian neorealism. Roma, Città e Porta, the 1945 film made by Roberto Rossellini, was the first anti-fascist film, the first film that signaled the arrival of Italian neorealism. It is a movie about the collaboration of the Catholics and the communists who fought against the Nazi occupation of Rome before the American army liberated the city. And some of the shots were actually shot during the real action. Rome, open city, that is how it has been translated. Open city, Rome. Roma, Città e Porta. Rome, open city, Rome, or Rome, open city. So Rossellini wanted to convey the cruel atmosphere that existed during Nazi occupation, and many of the film's narrative elements are based on actual events. And then you come to the film that we have to discuss, Bicycle thieves. Ladri di Biciclette in Italian, the 1948 film. Vittorio De Sica's masterpiece, a landmark film for the neorealist movement. Again, a film that is always part of any list of the best films ever made, involving a father and a son and their desperate search for a bicycle, which takes you through the streets of and the villages of post-war Italy. The streets, the towns, and the villages of post-war Italy. Yeah, so we will discuss the film in great detail, the film of the two ordinary people, the father and the son in The Bicycle Thieves, in the next class. Okay. I hope it's clear to you, this introduction.